Speed, sound. Camera speed.
All right, what's up, man? How you been? We haven't been here in a long while.
No, we haven't been here in a long while. I'm always doing the best I can. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm alive.
How's Helen?
Good. We're both alive.
And Jeff? And the kids?
Well, the kids, they're busy. 4 kids are tough.
How often are you getting to see them?
We're going to see them this week. We're going down to Oregon.
Awesome.
They're down the shore place.
Awesome.
But,
So what else has been going on? I know you've been interviewed a lot recently.
yeah, all sorts of stuff. We're so happy we're down the shore, to hang out with the kids, and so it's going to be great. But it dominates my life now. It always has dominated, but now it's day after day after day. It's really getting on Helen also.
It's dominated both of our lives for the past 20 years. For me, 19 and a half years. For you, almost 20 years.
All right, we've been talking for so many years. Tell me exactly. I'm losing my mind over, I guess. When did you exactly get involved with 9/11?
Well, unfortunately, I was like most dumb Americans on 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I wanted to carpet bomb the Middle East. I wanted to me, every Arab was a terrorist. And I was just so ignorant. And, I was that way for a long time. I was glued to the television set. I had to know exactly what was going to happen next. And then in January of 2002, Bush and Cheney went to Tom Daschle's office, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and asked him specifically not to investigate the attacks at all. And I had a thought, why would the President and Vice President, of all people, not want to know exactly how and why this happened so as to make sure it could never happen again? And after 9/11, we were told repeatedly that there were no warnings, that nobody had any idea that this could happen, that it was completely by surprise, a surprise attack. And on May 15th, 2002, news of what was called the August 6th presidential daily briefing was leaked. And this is an intelligence report that the president receives every day. And it was called Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S. It spoke of buildings in New York. It talked of hijackings or other types of attacks. So once I found out that we were lied to and that there was a warning, I was off to the races. I had to know exactly what we were being lied to about, and I started to really research our government. And my main focus was the Iran-Contra affair. That's kind of where I started, because there were a lot of the same players, around from that time. And, I started to read about some of the drug trade that was going on amongst the CIA, and this government was not what we were led to believe after all these years. We weren't the greatest country in the world. And again, I started to collect and archive articles and news articles, a lot like Paul Thompson. Paul Thompson, he and I were both off to the races once the August 6th PDB was released. He did something phenomenal, and he started the complete 9/11 timeline, and I just did so much research. I made so many phone calls to so many different reporters. I would read a news article, and if there was somebody mentioned in the news article, I would call that individual and get it on source, what they had to say. And in June 11th, 2002, the family members held a rally in Washington, D.C. to have an investigation, because the Bush administration did not want to investigate the 9/11 attacks. So the families had to fight for the 9/11 Commission, for the so-called 9/11 Commission. And it's scary in that we wouldn't even have had that commission, as corrupt and compromised as it was, if not for the family members. So, go ahead.
If not for the Jersey girls.
If not for the Jersey girls.
Not necessarily the family members.
The Jersey girls, Lori Van Auken.
So you're talking 5 family members.
Right.
Yeah.
Lori Van Auken, Mindy Kleinberg, Patty Casaza, and Kristen Breitweiser. Monica Gabrielle as well.
Monica, yeah.
And Sally Regan Hart as well.
So 7.
If not for them, we would not have had that. They forced Washington, D.C. to do what they should have automatically done. And Lori gave me a quote once. She said, at a time when my kids were traumatized, I had to go down to D.C. and do what should have automatically taken place. I'll never forget that quote. So anyway, I did so much research, and eventually I was introduced to different aspects of the 9/11 truth movement. And I think the first thing I was introduced to was Paul Thompson and Alan Wood wrote an article entitled "An Interesting Day," which focused on Bush's actions that morning, and it was based on all of these mainstream articles, and it just seemed so legitimate and credible to me, and I just couldn't believe the different things that they were writing. So then from that point on, I started to follow what Paul was doing, and then from there I was introduced to Mike Rupert and the different things that he was doing, and I was also introduced to 9/11 Citizens Watch, which was founded by Kyle Hentz and John Judge, and what they did is they monitored the 9/11 Commission. They worked with the 9/11 family members. In fact, they helped the 9/11 family members to hold people under oath, which is something the families fought for, for the 9/11 commissioners to hold people under oath, which is something they were not doing. And so again, I was introduced to them. I was introduced to Janice Matthews of 911truth.org, and I just started working with them. And that's essentially how I became involved. And the Jersey Girls, they were media darlings prior to the 9/11 Commission, during the 9/11 Commission. But once the 9/11 report was released and the official account was set in stone, the Jersey Girls became persona non grata. They just were ignored. Any effort that they took was just completely ignored. And on September 9th, 2004, something called the 9/11 omission hearings were held in New York City. And I didn't get to see it live. I was home in Philadelphia. But I heard the very first audio of you speaking. And you started crying. It was the first time I had ever heard a 9/11 family member cry because they didn't know.
Is that the only time?
What?
Is that the only time?
It was the first time I heard a 9/11 family member cry because they didn't know and they wanted to know. And I was sitting in my apartment and I was bawling my eyes out. And I swore right then and there that I would do everything within my power to fight alongside, to support the family members that were fighting for truth, accountability, and justice. And that's what I had devoted my life to. And at the 9/11 omission hearings, Janet Workin, who founded the WTCO, the World Trade Center Environmental Organization, spoke about the environmental impact of 9/11. And I had never heard of any of this stuff. I had no idea that there were people that were sick from the environmental impact. I had no idea that, Chrissy Todd Whitman was directed by the White House to lie about the environmental impact, that the air was safe to breathe, that the water was safe to drink. And it was such a crime. I looked up second-degree murder, and it covered it perfectly, what they had done. And people belong in prison for what they had done, and nobody was ever held accountable. People that should be now rotting in prison were just never held accountable. So I then started focusing on helping the 9/11 first responders. And, I held the very first fundraiser for the 9/11 first responders that I'm aware of. The money went towards the Feel Good Foundation and another organization that isn't worth mentioning because, as it turns out, they were a corrupt organization. And I didn't know that at the time. Then I held another fundraiser, and before I knew it, people across the country were holding fundraisers and sending money to the Feel Good Foundation. And that essentially put the Feel Good Foundation on the map. And I was very proud of that. And after that, I was given, the honorary director plaque, which I brought with me, if somebody wants to bring it. I was made honorary director of the Feel Good Foundation. And just so people know, it's the same foundation that Jon Stewart went to Washington, D.C. with to fight for, to fight for the health care that they needed, that they desperately needed. So I was very proud of that.
Honorary director. Jeez.
Honorary director. It's been hanging on my wall ever since.
Is John Feel around?
John Feel is still doing his thing, so far as I know. The Feel Good Foundation has done a number of things. I believe they paid off different mortgages for 9/11 first responders' houses. And they've done a number of things over the years. But, unfortunately, John was told at one point that he can't associate with the 9/11 Truth Movement if he wants to get the help that he needs. And I understood that because it was such an important issue in and of itself to get health care for the first responders. I didn't like it. I wanted to continue to help them, but it was what it was.
Do we have a 9/11 Truth Movement anymore? Is it shot? Are we done?
I think there are people that still care about the issue out there. I don't know that there's a uniformed effort. I know there are still people out there pushing crazy, nonsensical theories that, they push them as fact. I know that there are people out there that create these litmus tests that you must believe this or that, or you're not a real member of the 9/11 Truth Movement.
All right, you said that. And this is it's difficult for me. Of course, Bobby was murdered. I want to find, and I spent so much time talking about how he died. And the thing is, I'm sick of getting emotional. Okay, I really am. And I really want to talk about who the hell killed Bobby. All right.
Well.
And where I really am not involved with the fringe. Am I fringe movement?
No. You're a family member. How can a family member be called an
But the thing is,
conspiracy?
if I put a certain blame on it, when do I become fringe and who is not fringe? All right. Is someone talking about Saudi Arabia committed the act of 9/11? Is someone talking about Iraq, so forth and so on? Are they? Who is fringe?
That's a good question. People to me who push the official story may as well be considered fringe.
So who are the people that the people are calling fringe though?
Well, people who say there were holograms that were planes that, nonsensical things like that. That an remote-controlled anti-gravity ball, which is one of the funniest ones I'd ever heard, brought down the towers that day, or beams from space brought down the towers. Judy Woods. But, to me, 9/11 was not an act of war. It was a crime. And as with every other crime, there are suspects for that crime. And by their own actions and inactions, elements within our government and other governments have more than earned the title of suspect for the crime of 9/11. If you want to start naming names, you could talk about Dick Cheney. You could talk about George Tenet. You could talk about Donald Rumsfeld as suspects for the crime of 9/11.
But I have a problem putting Rumsfeld, George Bush, Cheney into the equation because this country would sacrifice them in a minute. Do they really? I don't think any of them have any power. There's not a president of the United States has ever had any power. So who has the real power in this country?
There's no question that politicians that serve in D.C. serve the money that get them into power.
So then we're talking money. So that's why I say I hate using Cheney, Bush, because they would gladly throw any one of them under the bus.
I don't know who the people were behind the scenes, but they certainly deserve to be looked at. They were certainly in charge of things that took place that day. Cheney was the vice president, and as far as I'm concerned, the vice president's powers were to break a tie in the Senate, to take over as president in the event that the president is killed, or if the president goes in for surgery for a few hours, he takes over as president. Those are the only powers that I'm aware of that the vice president has. And yet on 9/11, Dick Cheney was calling the shots. He shouldn't have been anywhere near there as far as calling the shots.
But do you understand where I'm going, though?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is suddenly your theory got publicity all over the world? Good, let's go after Dick Cheney. Is he dead yet?
No.
All right, we go after Dick Cheney. Say, here we can prove this. He orchestrated 9/11.
The thing about holding people accountable is that once you start holding people accountable, chances are they're going to start to talk rather than take.
Has anyone ever talked about Kennedy? Who's responsible for Kennedy?
Who's been held accountable for Kennedy?
Well,
anyone? Besides, Ruby and Oswald, who was killed.
Right. And of course, who was held accountable for 9/11? Muslims. And I understand what you're saying, going after Kennedy, but it's so easy for him to shift that.
That's something I want to bring up. I talked about.
I'm so sorry. Could you just scoot in a little
Sure.
bit? I'm so sorry. This is beautiful. I just wanted you a little bit closer to him. Thank you. Great.
Something I wanted to talk about. I had mentioned that after 9/11, I was just like every other American. All Arabs were terrorists, and Since that time, I have learned that that's a phrase known as collective punishment, which is a war crime. And I have learned that people in the Middle East are no different than we are. They have families, they have friends, they have jobs, they have hobbies, and they're no different than we are. And yet, how many millions have we murdered in the Middle East and displaced and wounded that had absolutely nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks? It's an absolute atrocity, and so many people deserve to be held accountable for what happened. And I just wanted to mention that.
I agree with you 100%, but I just don't like, again, it's too easy to put a blame. They could go after Cheney any day of the week. George Bush is the biggest idiot that ever walked the face of the earth. And he became president of the United States. Hold it.
Go ahead.
But the thing is, to hold these people accountable, that's why I've gone into history. History is so important to me because we've been doing this bullshit forever.
Right.
You know what I mean? And again, you know, I could go from World War One and what happened in World War One. And I don't want to go into the long history, but the system is bad. The system created this. The system killed anyone that's going to try to make a change, including Kennedy. And this is, to me, so how do you go into the system?
Well, we talk about that all the time, and one of the things we always come back to is how hard the media is. If the media had done their jobs, none of us would have had to do what we've been trying to do over the past 20 years.
But they've never done their job.
I want to talk a little bit about George Bush. 10 days after his inauguration at his very first principals meeting, the topic A was to, quote, go find me a way to get into Iraq. So there's motive right there. Go find me a way. And then later, in the later months of 2001, according, I think, to Richard Clark, who is also a suspect, people in the Bush administration were discussing creating a casus belli, a cause for war, in order to go to war in Iraq. Something like a 9/11 or the anthrax attacks, which were most definitely caused by elements within our government. There's no question of that.
Yeah.
And they were also used to point the finger at Iraq. But, again, in the months prior to 9/11, Bush and Prince Bandar were talking about the need for decisive military action in Iraq. And apparently, if you want to go to the Saudi angle, Prince Bandar helped to finance the attacks. And on the day that Bush and Cheney spoke with the 9/11 Commission, behind closed doors, with no transcripts allowed, with no recordings or any notes allowed, he held a press conference afterwards, and he said he answered every question that he was asked. Meanwhile, we find out that John Lehman, was one of the commissioners, was pressing him specifically on the issue of Bandar and his financing, or his wife's financing of two of the hijackers, and Bush dodged the questions, according to John Lehman. Therefore, he didn't answer every question. To me, that's a form of obstruction of justice, and he may as well be brought in for that alone. I mean, there's so many things so many different things that you could be brought in for.
And to me, that's a big problem with 9/11. There's so many things.
Of course.
By choice, by design.
Probably.
And that keeps us discussing back and forth. We've been
Exactly.
doing this for 20
Which
years.
is why I can't say definitively that I know what happened on 9/11. But again, not knowing is a problem in and of itself.
I know what's happened.
To the building.
The buildings were blown up. Throw out the planes. I don't give a shit about the planes one way or another.
No.
Okay? Well, I'll go back to
Okay.
Bobby. Bobby died because of explosions. There was explosions before the planes hit. I don't care what anybody says. So I don't really give a shit about the building or the planes. All right, so then we say, all right, who blew them up? Well, I don't really care who blew them up. To me, it's why. And that's the only thing I do now, John. And that's where history comes in. Why would they blow up those buildings? And my main thing is the Pentagon. The Pentagon was the crux of that whole September 11th.
Well,
Hold it, let me
go ahead.
finish. And the crime, killing or destroying the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence. I don't think a plane hit the Pentagon. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I'll swear on it until the day I die.
this is an era of contention with me because I've never been one to say that Flight 77 never hit the Pentagon, and I have reasons why. There was debris with American Airlines logos on them there that I don't believe anybody would have had the time to plant. to me, the important question has always been, how is it possible that 34 minutes after the second tower was hit, when everybody in the world knew America was under attack, that a hijacked commercial airliner managed to penetrate D.C. airspace and hit the Pentagon? How is that possible?
Well,
So many protocols were not followed that day. I mean, there were hijackings throughout the 60s and the 70s. In fact, there was multiple hijackings, simultaneous hijackings that took place. It was called the Dawson's Field hijackings. Took place in the 70s. And yet no protocols were written for such no contingency plans were written for such a thing.
Right, that's right. We're agreeing it's an inside job. First of all, I don't think it's no way in the world. It could have been a plane flown by the military.
For all we know.
Well, I don't care. There's no way in the world. Who was it? Handjar, right? Flew the plane.
And Tommy Handjar supposedly.
We could do a better job than he could. If we just took a plane out now, we could do a better job. So there's no way. It's 100% impossible that he flew that plane in the Pentagon.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about. I mean, it shows you how bad this country is. If I were a hijacker, okay, and I wanted to do damage to the United States, and I spent all this time, and I know I'm going to die, so I make a 270-degree turn to fly in to the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence.
Right.
There was hardly anybody in there. So I could have hit the White House. I could have dove right into the White House easily. I could have hit on the other side of the building and hit and killed Cheney, the Defense Department.
Right.
Yet I decided to drive all the way around in danger of other planes stopping me. Come down. Now we're talking how fast? 500 miles an hour?
Yes.
And you've never flown a commercial plane in your life. Well, first of all, he couldn't possibly do that. And secondly, if he was thinking, he would have just dove right into the White House.
Paul Thompson years ago found news of somebody, and I cannot for the life of me remember his name, who apparently was an associate of the hijackers, who said it actually was not Hani Hanjour who flew that plane. Regardless, it was an amazing thing that they managed to do that they probably should not have been able to do. That being said, there was a book called Firefight, written by 9/11 first responders who were there at the Pentagon that day, that talked about how they found charred remains of bodies still in their seats from the planes within the buildings. And actually, I just yesterday, I don't know if people are familiar with Shoestring. He's a contributor to historycommons.org. He posted an entry about how somebody managed to put a note about what may have happened on that plane, and they had ingested it into their stomach so that people would be able to find it later. And they knew to do that because it wouldn't digest. It would be kept safe, in the event that there was a fire or something. They apparently found the note. We don't know what it said, but that
Who found the note?
I don't remember the story exactly.
Well, but that right.
I'm just saying that supposedly he was on 77. So there's another passenger who was found in 77.
Well, all right. Beside that, I don't believe it. All right.
I know.
But do you see what we're doing here? We're arguing about it.
I know, and that's what happened.
Well, but the thing is, why was the Office of Naval Intelligence hit? There was only one reason and one reason only, because they were investigating the securities back in the early 90s that were in Cantor Fitzgerald, that were in Eurobrokers.
Right.
Okay? That's, to me, just come out, it's the only logical explanation. They had to bring out $240 billion I don't want to go into the whole history. Well, they had to bring it out of the securities. In other words, they had to just take out 240 because they were due right after 9/11. Okay, so then they just printed money, put it in so they could bring this money out.
Who's to say that explosives weren't already planted in the ONI area prior to a plane hitting?
Well, of course they were.
But I'm saying it may not have been the plane that I don't know, but I guarantee that there are so many theories, like the plane flying over the Pentagon and dropping a bomb.
But it's a waste of time even talking about it.
I know, but that gets so much attention.
Yeah, but the thing is,
those are the kinds of things that the media glom onto, and what they do is they glom onto those kinds of theories and portray them as if everybody believes them.
All right, well that's the job of the press.
I know.
That's where I'm going in this direction. That is the crux of 9/11.
Right.
To hit Cantor Fitzgerald, to hit Eurobrokers, to hit Tower 2, because the Office of Naval Intelligence was investigating this money, floating money that was going through, of course, was on the 12th taken out of the government, and the government put it in, so there'd be no loss. And it was, the whole thing was to overthrow Russia. But no one talks about that. You never heard anything about it. And I read it a long time ago, and I haven't been able to even think about talking about it because it's so complex. But we're talking the overthrow of Russia, Gorbachev, okay? And Russia became broke because they were able to, with other people, but
we destroyed them.
Oh, we destroyed them. And Yeltsin was a big part of that because he was, he came to America to help us out. And even Putin came back, and when finally Putin came in, he got rid of the oligarchs that were part of this, but he will not talk about what happened. Okay, so this, and of course, when did bin Laden declare fatwa?
86 or 8? No, I'm sorry.
98. 98. All right, that's when they decided we have to do something about this. We got a problem. So then bin Laden was always in their pocket.
I have to say now, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the one who came up with the idea of putting in the Mujahideen into the Afghanistan-Russia war to fight as a proxy against the Russians. We were told that after the Afghanistan-Russia war stopped, all support for the Mujahideen ended, and the Mujahideen became Al-Qaeda. Lo and behold, during the 90s, we supported those very same groups in the Balkans and in the Caucasus, all the way up until supposedly 9/11. Then after 9/11, we supported those same groups in places like Libya and Syria and elsewhere. So the United States has been absolutely supportive of Al-Qaeda, the creators of Al-Qaeda, and so there is absolutely, if you're creating terrorists or using terrorists, then how could you ever say that there's a justification for a war on terror? Just like FBI entrapment that we have right now, where the FBI creates these stings, where they create these terrorist attacks, and then they arrest the people who are supposedly involved and say, hey, look, we stopped the terrorist attack. Well, if you're creating terrorists again, how can you say that there's a justification for a war on terror? There's so many logical arguments like that that just completely blow the whole thing out of the water.
Well, there you go. That's the press. They create this situation.
Right.
And bin Laden, we worked with bin Laden for over 20 years.
Absolutely.
But the thing is, if the press doesn't cover it, then it doesn't exist. Yeah, have we ever heard, we've never heard a show about this, a movie about this. It just won't happen.
If there are, like Oliver Stone, I think, did this whole thing, the history of the United States or something like that, and when he got to 9/11, he kind of just skipped over that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what are you doing? It's infuriating that more people don't speak out or do more to bring attention to this issue, which is still a pivotal issue of our day. I was just speaking to Kelly about how the 2001 authorization for use of military force that was written after 9/11 to go after those supposedly responsible for 9/11 has been used in Afghanistan, used for Iraq, used in Libya, used in Syria, all these places where the people had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. It's still in play. It still hasn't been rescinded. And they talk about it, they play with talking about taking it away, but they never do. And then they talk about creating a new authorization for use of military force. Any enemies that exist today against the United States exist directly from our response to 9/11 and what we did in the Middle East. Those enemies were created from those responses.
You're absolutely right, but let's go back to the 50s.
That's before my time.
It's all about capitalism.
Right.
Okay? We talk about freedom and democracy, right? It sounds great on paper. But again, just using Mossadegh in Iran, 1952. He becomes 53. He becomes a democratically elected president.
Right.
He worked with he wanted British oil out of there. Mm-hmm. And no way in the world that was going to happen. Well, so they went to Truman to have Truman back them up. They weren't going to allow him to take away their oil rights. So they were going to make a deal with him. So what do? We go and he was a democratically. So we take the democracy. This is the freedom of people in Iran to democratically elect someone.
I'm trying to think of the name. That was Operation Ajax?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, I could just sit here and take it from that point on. So anytime a democracy In other words, if it's socialist, and it's always been about communism, 5 minutes after World War II, the Germans were our friends. The Germans are sent down to Latin America. The Germans are brought over here.
Many Germans. It wasn't just Operation Paperclip where we brought in scientists. We brought in a multitude of Nazis into this country who I think might still be collecting Social Security.
Oh, they definitely are. Well, with that, so communism became the ultimate evil. Communism, Russia lost 20 million people in the World War II.
Can you believe that we would be considered communists or socialists just for what we're speaking about today, when it's all about truth, accountability, and justice? You know, the family members of all people both deserve and require absolute truth and justice for what happened to their loved ones that day.
But
there's no...
But the United States has never done something like that.
Of course not.
So it's silly talking about it. You know what I mean? It's great to say it, John, but history dictates what we have done and will continue to do.
It's got to end somewhere. It's got to end somewhere.
It won't. And so, well, and I'm not here to politicize, socialism, communism, but the system, which is unfettered capitalism. They don't give a shit about anyone in the world, and it's happened everywhere.
Right.
So it's not democracy; it's unfettered capitalism. And if they talk about democracy, and if someone has democracy in Iran or Venezuela, Peru, Guatemala, if it's not exactly the way we want it, where we don't have unfettered access to their natural resources, it ain't going to happen.
Right.
So we sent someone in to overthrow. And who you send in? Well, you send in the FBI, John Perkins.
CIA.
Or CIA, I'm sorry. The Diary of an Economic Hitman. How he goes in, sets up, and if they don't abide by, boom, we send the troops in.
Yep,
and that's what it's all about, and that's the reason for 9/11.
We did that all throughout South America. South
Yeah.
America is completely
Africa.
destroyed.
Look at the Congo. In 1 century, we talk about the horror of the world. 1 century, 20 million people have died in the Congo. Why? Lithium, all our phones, gold, diamonds.
You know, it's
platinum.
funny. During the Afghanistan-Russia war, Russia discovered that there was today it's worth $3 trillion worth of money, lithium deposits. Suddenly, the United States supposedly discovered it, even though they were most likely aware of what the Russians knew. In Afghanistan, oh my God, there's $3 trillion worth of lithium. And Mike Rupert, in his documentary Truth and Lies of 9/11, talked about Zbigniew Brzezinski writing in his book The Grand Chessboard just exactly what was available within Afghanistan. And he talked about the minerals and the gold and the oil and the gas and the stuff like that. So we knew these things were in there. And lo and behold, luckily we're in Afghanistan.
Yep.
And, we're saying that we're leaving Afghanistan, but how many mercenaries, how many thousands are we still leaving there? It's disgusting.
So that's why I just think it's, it's why I don't like talking about Bobby anymore, because Bobby, he's like one of millions and millions and millions and millions of people that have suffered because of this idea that we have.
And Bobby is yours.
Well, but again, it's just the rest of the world has, someone has to speak up for the rest of the world. And I like to do it. If I get an opportunity to do it, I'll do it. Because it's the way the world is. And it is changing. I think the rest of the world sees it and they want to change, but it's just...
They do see, but it's so hard to push against the fascism that exists within this country. I mean, just the post 9/11 world itself militarized the police. And then we use soldiers who worked in Afghanistan and Iraq. They come back and they become police officers, and they treat us no differently than they treated people in those countries. It's disgraceful. As far as I'm concerned, if you served in the military, you should not be anywhere near a police precinct. They should get people off the streets. They should have cops work and live in the neighborhood. They should have cops work in the neighborhoods that they live in, so they give a little bit more shit about it. One of the things I wanted to talk about were some of the smoking guns of 9/11, and one of the things that has gotten the most attention over the years is the buildings. And I got a lot of flack for this over the years because that was never my focus. I'm not a physicist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an architect. I couldn't tell you one way or the other what happened to those buildings from a technical standpoint. I can only hear stories about Willie Rodriguez or what happened to Bobby and come to my own conclusions. But that is where the majority of the people were murdered that day. There are family members that still question how those buildings came down, and as long as it's an important question to them, it will always be an important question to me. And one of the things that I've always focused on was the 9/11 Commission itself, and how much of a whitewash and how compromised and absolutely corrupt it was. And the reason was that was presented to the world as the definitive account of 9/11. That's an exact quote from Tom Keene. And it was anything but. First of all, they only answered 30% of the family's well-researched questions. And, you know, Philip Zelikow, somebody I love to talk about, was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. And Paul Sperry wrote that he's the one responsible for who would be the witnesses, what questions would be asked, and so on and so forth. So he was in charge. He had more power than any of the 9/11 commissioners. And some of the things that he did during the 9/11 Commission was he tried to insert a false link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda into the 9/11 report. I think he had Abraham Sofer and Laurie Milroy, who were supposed experts in Al-Qaeda's connections to Iraq, who were just absolute charlatans, you know, testify before the 9/11 Commission. And people like Lori Van Auken, who lost her husband Kenneth, you know, confronted Philip Zelikow. And she said that he had a little sly smile across his face when confronted about it. And what happened was some of the staffers and the family members pushed against it, and it didn't make it into... I mean, Iraq was not absolved by the 9/11 report by any stretch of the imagination. Another thing that he did was he rewrote the 9/11 Commission's report to be more favorable of Condoleezza Rice. He blocked half of the Saudi interview requests for the Saudi investigators. And I know Saudi Arabia is just one aspect of it. Somebody by the name of Dana Lieseman, who was on the Joint Congressional Inquiry, helped to write this famous 28 redacted pages. She was trying to do her job during the 9/11 Commission. She wanted access to those 28 redacted pages, and he blocked her from having access to them. And so she went through a back channel in order to gain access to them, and he fired her as a result of that. You know, you were there. You were there every day. What could you name the
All right. Well, I hate putting names into a thing. If I put the pyramid of individuals, if I just wanted to say individuals, Philip Zelikow would be right there at the top, with Cheney.
Right.
Okay. With Rumsfeld. Okay. And another one I would put would be Robert Mueller.
Yep.
Robert Mueller, our great FBI head.
Yep.
What, the week before 9/11, he was made FBI director. Was it week before, I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and so and again, but just say I got my wish, and someone magically said, all right, we're going to put all 5 of them into jail for life.
right.
Even execute them. It wouldn't do me a bit of good. You know what I mean? You
Right.
understand what I'm saying about people?
I know.
I agree with Zelikow. I mean, when I was there, our Condoleezza Rice is another one.
Right.
The August 6th memo, everyone talks about. I've never, ever, ever, and since that day, I have tremendous anger. I try to split it up in 24 hours. Only when I do my 9/11 work. But she was doing a filibuster. Everyone knows what a filibuster. Just talking nonsense.
Nonsense.
Absolute,
It's historical in nature.
absolute nonsense. But every commissioner only had 5 minutes, so she could bullshit herself right through each commissioner, and then she leaves.
Well,
And so she, but again, she's just a little part of the system.
right. Phil Sheenan wrote a book called The Commission, and in that book he spoke about how Karl Rove, the deputy White House chief of staff at the time, had communications with Philip Zelikow. So Zelikow may very well have been taking direction from Karl Rove, and the fact that he tried to insert a false link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda shows that he was a Bush lackey to begin with. So once that revelation came, the Jersey Girls called for an entirely new investigation. The only news outlet in the country that covered that was Raw Story. If that had gotten the attention that it deserved, who knows where we would have been today. And that's one aspect of the news. They don't seem to understand what the definition of newsworthy is anymore, if they ever did. And I'd just like to briefly mention the documentaries 9/11 Press for Truth, which came out in 2006, and the following year, in their own words, The Untold Stories of the 9/11 Families, which is just the footage that didn't make it into Press for Truth. Not one news outlet in this country covered either of those documentaries, and these were documentaries that included the Jersey Girls, who I called media darlings before, who became persona non grata after the release of the 9/11 report. The only people that covered those documentaries were movie critics, and they gave them, great reviews. All of them gave them great reviews. If any of those documentaries got the attention they deserved, I believe this would have been a better world, which is why I gave them the money to finish it. Kyle Hentz called me one day and he started telling me about these documentaries that he was working on. And I said, what is it about? And he's like, it's about Paul Thompson's timeline and it's about the Jersey Girls. And I'm like, oh my God. He's like, you wouldn't happen to have money, asking me for money. And I'm like, I'll ask my father. Because it was so important to me to get those documentaries done and made. So, Philip Zelikow absolutely belongs in prison. I have no question of that. And what I've mentioned is only scratches the surface of what he did. He and Ernest May essentially wrote the 9/11 report. I believe that when you can prove to the world that the definitive account of 9/11 was nothing but an absolute farce, and prove to the world that because of that we don't know the truth about 9/11, it's not rocket science to say we need an actual real investigation that's outside of the vested interest of those with a vested interest in suppressing the truth, outside the reach.
Who would that be?
And nobody on the Beltway. Family members.
All right, let's agree to that. They won't do that.
Architects and engineers, perhaps. Any of the experts that have been willing to sacrifice the last 20 years of their lives. Me, I could be on there. Paul Thompson could be on there. Colleen Rowley could be on there. Jenna Orkin could be on there. And I'm not tooting my own horn. I would put any of those people before me because I learned from these people. But, anything would have been better than what we got.
No, there's no question about that. But again, say they did that, or say an investigation, or who would be, my whole thing now, and I've spent so much time with myself, say Zelikow again, say he's executed. Again, I'll go back to that point. All these people are executed. It would do no good for me whatsoever. In other words, I'm not looking for retribution. I'm looking for the system that's created this havoc in the world.
Don't you think that if these people were held accountable, maybe it would open up the door to putting an end to everything that the post 9/11 world entails?
Because then we'd have a trial that was fixed. It's.
If the entire country woke up to the fact that we were lied to about 9/11, which we were, I think this would be a different country. We would all have one focus, and I always thought that we'd be able to do that, but because of the media and how they treated us and belittled us and so forth, it never got to the...
All right. There goes the problem of this country and the world, is the media.
Yep.
I think media is more... there's more blame for the media responsible for 9/11 than anyone, because you can't possibly do it.
Without
we talked about, what's the name? What did I say the guy's name was? 5 minutes after 9/11.
I don't remember.
On TV. I forget his name now. Oh, Walsh's name. He's standing there with a mic in front of him after the buildings came down. And he's standing there and saying, and he did work for CBS part-time. Now, he's announcing to the world that this is obvious it was a bin Laden attack.
Right.
And that's it. 5 minutes afterwards, and from then on, bin Laden is responsible for 9/11. And the idiots in this country, we believe it, but then who pushed that? Of course, the media. So the media is part of it.
And bin Laden denied it on 3 separate occasions.
Yeah, of course he did, but that doesn't matter.
Right.
But just because this idiot's on TV, immediately, and then we're all family members are just, my God, well, anyone could say something. And he also said when he's talking to the news media, right? He said, I stood here and I saw that plane go in and come out the other side. And I saw those buildings come down. That's and this is what we got. And this is the whole story. So from that minute on, the Muslims and Osama bin Laden were responsible for not, just because somebody stood there and said, this is what it is.
Right.
And I, talk about the planes, but he said, I saw a plane go in and I saw a plane come out. And you see the pictures of it, and they got rid of this real fast, but you see the nose cone coming out.
Oh, Dan Rather
We
talked
can
about...
I could punch a hole in the front of the plane. That's how fragile they are. And they're saying that plane came, I'm not saying, I'm not going to talk about the planes, but he saw a plane go in, all the steel framing in the building, come out, all the steel framing through, and that nose came out perfectly intact.
Dan Rather made a comment about WTC-7 that day, about the collapse of WTC-7 looking like a controlled demolition. Am I right about that? Thank you. So a number of people made different comments that day that we probably should look at.
But they're squelched.
Yeah, they're absolutely squelched. Just like, okay, the media over the years have reported on certain lies or different aspects of lies concerning the 9/11 attacks, but they only give it one segment, and it never is touched on again. So hardly anybody gets to see it, and I would fish for those little segments and put them on my little YouTube channel just so people would be able to see them. That's one of the things I did over the years. There are two questions I want to ask people that are watching this documentary, and the first one is, in what world does it make sense not to investigate the murder of 2,977 plus people, knowing that we were lied to about that day and knowing what that day has been used for? And in what world does it make sense to constantly attack, slander, and misrepresent those seeking truth, accountability, and justice, knowing we were lied to about that day and knowing what that day has been used for? I really want people to think about that.
Well, that's a simple answer, though. That's America's world.
That's America's world.
Well, there's the answer.
So America's got to change.
Well,
America's got to grow up. The people of America have got to grow up. They've got to get out of this they would never mentality. If they would never, then they would never lie about the environmental impact of 9/11 causing upwards of 70,000 9/11 first responders to become sick and dying. They would never do a number of things. Like, look what they did during the pandemic, all the multitude of crimes they committed during the pandemic. This government is more than capable of anything. And that's something that the American people have to realize and have to accept.
Well, that's why we were speaking on the break, and this is the way I look at it. It is like saying, can your mother and father be evil? I don't care. I was in the bar business, and I would talk to kids, and I knew their fathers, and their fathers would beat the hell out of them constantly. But kids come in like a generation, next generation, and never say anything mean about their father. In the back of his mind, he knew that. But the thing is, and I think that's the way it is with America. They're not going to. That's their mother, and that's their father. The media in America is
It's a form of Stockholm syndrome.
Well, of course it is. But that's the way it is in America. So how's it going to change? And that's why I'll get back to the media. The media is just as fault for 9/11 as anyone. Because you could not have done this without the media's.
The media needs to be broken up into hundreds of different non-profit companies so that it's not based on the dollar, so that would force them to compete for the best story. Something like the fairness doctrine needs to be brought back so that it would give us equal time.
Well, they had that.
I know, and they did away with it. And every year, politicians try to
right.
bring it back, and it's never brought back.
Not many politicians.
Not many, but it is brought up.
Yeah, it won't go anywhere.
Right.
So, that is the crux. So, again, I hate naming individuals. The system is bad. The system, I will call the system evil. And I don't care who it is. I'd love to debate anybody about that. I really would.
One thing I want to talk about, on May 22nd, 2013, I broke my back. And I spent a month in the hospital, and then I spent 7 months in a rehab, like a nursing home facility. And Bob was one of the few people that came to visit me every week. And when I finally managed to get an apartment of my own, we continued the tradition, and we came to this diner every week for 7 years, and every day or every week he would buy me breakfast. And I couldn't afford, breakfast. So that's that's what he did for me. And I told Dylan, I said, Bob is probably my best friend today. So I just want to thank you for that.
Oh, well, where else are we going to talk about 9/11? It might be selfish part of my,
It's our own little therapy session.
you know, you couldn't do without it. Because I had no one to talk to 9/11. My wife doesn't know, no one wants to talk. My relatives don't want to talk to them. That's the problem. No one wants to talk about it.
I sacrificed so much doing this. I sacrificed family members. I sacrificed friends. And I have absolutely no regrets because it was always the right thing to do. As I mentioned, Philip Zelikow, to me, is a smoking gun of 9/11. And someone by the name of Hillary Cole drew this picture of me pointing to Philip Zelikow saying, we were lied to about 9/11, drilling holes in the 9/11 Commission's report. And I want to thank her for doing that. So thank you, Hillary, for doing that.
All right. Man,
Thanks, Bob.
thank you. So this is what we've been doing for the last 20 years, or how many years?
7
7 years.
years.